My name is Jake, and I've been a long-haul trucker for over 20 years. I thought I had seen everything the road had to offer: storms, accidents, even the occasional strange hitchhiker. But nothing compares to what happened last month, when I took a route through the mountains and found a tunnel that shouldn't have existed. It was just past 3 a.m. when I saw it. The highway curved sharply ahead, and as I rounded the bend, there it was, a long dark tunnel stretching into the mountain. I didn't remember ever seeing it before, but my GPS insisted it was the correct route. Maybe I had just never driven this way at night. I flicked on my high beams and entered. The moment I crossed the threshold, my radio cut to static. My dashboard clock froze at 3:17 a.m. A deep unease settled in my chest. Something was wrong. The tunnel was endless. I should have emerged within minutes, but the road stretched on, a monotonous, unchanging path. The yellow lane markings glowed faintly under my headlights, repeating in a pattern that started to feel unnatural, as if I were driving in place. I pressed the gas, but my speedometer stayed the same. Then, I saw something in my mirror, a shape. Vague, shifting, just at the edge of the darkness. I forced myself to focus on the road. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or exhaustion playing with my head. But deep down, I knew something was there. Watching then, the whispers started, soft, unintelligible at first, like a distant radio transmission. Then, clearer. Keep driving. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white. My headlights flickered, and for a split second, the tunnel around me seemed to ripple, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop. My hands started to sweat. The air grew thick, heavy, making it hard to breathe. I checked my phone. No signal. The GPS screen had gone black. That's when I saw the sign. A road sign on the right side of the tunnel, barely illuminated by my lights. The words were faded, almost unreadable. Turn back. A deep, primal fear surged through me. I slammed the brakes, but the truck didn't slow. My foot pressed uselessly against the pedal as the whispers grew louder. Keep driving. I looked in the mirror again. The shape was closer now. It had no form, no features, just darkness, shifting like smoke. But I could feel its eyes. A single thought consumed me. I couldn't let it reach me. I wrenched the wheel to the side. If stopping wasn't an option, maybe I could break free another way. The truck veered sharply, scraping against the tunnel wall with a metallic scream. Sparks flew. The whispers turned to shrieks. Then dash light, blinding golden light, flooded my vision. The truck lurched forward, and suddenly, I was outside, skidding onto a deserted highway. I slammed the brakes. The truck groaned to a stop. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at my surroundings. The road was unfamiliar. The stars above were all wrong, brighter than they should be, arranged in constellations I didn't recognize. And the sign next to me, it wasn't in any language I had ever seen. My radio crackled back to life, but the voice that came through wasn't dispatch. Welcome back. I didn't stick around. I threw the truck into gear and sped down the highway, hoping I'd find my way home. But deep down, I knew I had left something behind in that tunnel, and something had followed me out. My name is Luke, and I've been a highway patrol officer for almost a decade. I've dealt with reckless drivers, drug smugglers, and even the occasional high-speed chase. But nothing has unsettled me more than the night I encountered the convoy. It was just past midnight when the call came in. A trucker had reported an unusual sighting on Highway 17, a line of old, rusted military vehicles moving slowly down the road without any visible drivers. At first I thought it was a joke, but something in the caller's voice told me he was dead serious. I was only a few miles away, so I decided to check it out. As I approached, my dashboard lights flickered, and my radio filled with static. That was my first sign that something wasn't right. Then, I saw them. 6 trucks, all identical, moving in perfect synchronization. Their headlights were dim, as if struggling to stay lit, and the metal of their bodies was covered in patches of rust and grime. They looked decades old, out of place on the modern highway. I switched on my sirens and pulled up behind them, signaling for the convoy to stop. Then I grabbed my radio. "This is Officer Luke Daniels, requesting identification from the drivers of the military convoy on Highway 17. Pull over immediately." No response. The trucks continued forward, undeterred. I sped up alongside them, trying to get a look at who was inside. That's when I realized the cabs were empty. No drivers, no passengers, just empty seats behind cracked windshields. A shiver ran down my spine, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was some kind of remote-controlled experiment, a government test gone wrong. Still, I had to act. I pulled ahead of the lead truck and angled my cruiser sideways, blocking the road. For the first time, the convoy slowed. I stepped out, my hand hovering over my holster, and took a cautious step forward. The trucks were silent now, their engines idling, their presence oppressive. The air around me felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. Then, as if someone flipped a switch, all their headlights went out at once. Darkness swallowed the highway. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could switch it on, a voice whispered through my radio. "You weren't supposed to see this." The breath left my lungs. I spun around, searching for the source of the voice. But I was alone. I grabbed my radio, my fingers trembling. "Who's there?" Static. Then, another whisper. "Turn around." I ignored it. I had to figure out what was happening. I stepped closer to the nearest truck and reached for the handle. My fingers barely brushed the cold metal when the truck shuddered violently. The sound of grinding gears and screeching metal filled the air as the convoy roared to life again. Before I could react, the trucks began reversing fast. They moved in perfect unison, retreating down the highway at an impossible speed. My cruiser's lights flickered, and my radio continued to whisper unintelligible words. I jumped back, my breath coming in short gasps. As the convoy disappeared into the night, I stood there, frozen, listening to the silence that followed. The road was empty again. No tire marks, no lingering sounds of engines, as if they had never been there at all. I rushed back to my cruiser and called it in. Dispatch said there were no military convoys scheduled on Highway 17. No reports of missing vehicles. Nothing. But I know what I saw, and I know they saw me, too. My name is Rebecca, and I've been a rideshare driver for the past 3 years. It's not the safest job, especially at night, but I've never been one to scare easily. At least, that's what I used to believe before what happened last Friday. It was nearly 2 a.m., and I was about to call it a night when I received a ride request from an old, abandoned rest stop on Highway 47. I hesitated. The place had been shut down for years after a string of unexplained deaths. Still, curiosity got the best of me. Against my better judgment, I accepted the ride. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty. No cars, no people, just flickering lights, and a dilapidated building covered in graffiti. I checked the app again. The request was still active. The name on it simply read, Michael. I waited a few minutes, drumming my fingers against the steering wheel. Just as I was about to cancel the ride, my back door clicked open. My heart jumped. I hadn't seen anyone approach. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the seat was empty. A cold dread settled over me. I turned in my seat, scanning the back. Hello? No response. The door shut by itself, and the air inside the car grew freezing. My breath came out in white puffs. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but my hands wouldn't move. It was like something was keeping me in place. Then, the app's voice navigation spoke. Drive. The screen updated with a new destination, a location deep in the woods, far from any known roads. My phone refused to close the app, and the car's engine roared to life on its own. I wasn't in control anymore. With no other choice, I pressed the gas. The road ahead was shrouded in fog, the highway barely visible. The longer I drove, the stronger the feeling of being watched grew. Shadows flickered in my peripheral vision. My radio crackled, though it wasn't on. A whisper crawled through the speakers. "You picked him up." I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white. "Who's there?" The voice ignored me. "Don't look back." My pulse pounded. I kept my eyes on the road, resisting every urge to check the mirror. I didn't need to see it, I could feel it. Something was in the back seat, breathing, watching. The car suddenly jerked to the right. My hands remained locked on the wheel, but it turned on its own, steering me onto a dirt road leading into the forest. The lights of the highway disappeared. Behind me, I was completely alone. "Please," I whispered. "I don't want to do this." The whisper in the radio returned. "Almost there." The trees on either side grew denser, their branches clawing at the car like hands trying to drag me in. Then, up ahead, I saw it, a small, decrepit house with a single light glowing in the window. The car came to a stop. The back door opened with a slow creak. I didn't look. I didn't breathe. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, the door shut. The weight in the car was gone. The cold lifted, and I could move again. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel. I didn't dare check the mirror. I just slammed my foot on the gas and sped back toward the highway, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the interstate, I pulled over to catch my breath. My phone vibrated. I hesitated before looking at the screen. The ride had ended. No charge, no record of the trip, and the name Michael was gone. My name is Daniel, and I've spent the past 5 years working as a long-haul truck driver. I enjoy the solitude, the long stretches of open road, and the sense of freedom that comes with being constantly on the move. But after what happened last night, I don't think I'll ever be able to drive the interstate at night again. It started around 2 a.m. on a particularly desolate stretch of highway. The road was empty, save for the occasional passing car, and the only lights came from my high beams cutting through the thick darkness. I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere when I saw her standing on the side of the road, thumb outstretched, her pale face barely illuminated in the glow of my headlights. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair and a simple white dress that seemed oddly outdated. Something about her made me uneasy, but I'd picked up hitchhikers before. Maybe she'd run out of gas, or her car had broken down further up the road. Against my better judgment, I slowed to a stop and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked. She nodded but said nothing. Up close, she looked even paler than before, her skin almost translucent in the dim light. I motioned for her to get in, and she climbed into the passenger seat without a word. As soon as she shut the door, a sudden chill filled the cab, making my breath visible in the air. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to shake off the creeping unease. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a little further up the road. I'll tell you when to stop." I nodded and kept driving, the silence stretching between us. Every so often, I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye. She sat unnaturally still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring straight ahead. I tried to make small talk, but she didn't respond. The unease in my stomach twisted into something heavier, something closer to fear. About 10 miles later, she finally spoke again. "Here." I slowed down and pulled onto the shoulder, but when I turned to tell her we'd arrived, my breath caught in my throat. The seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. There had been no sound, no movement. She was just gone. My heart pounded as I scanned the road, half expecting to see her standing outside, but there was nothing. Just the vast, empty highway stretching endlessly in both directions. Swallowing hard, I reached for my phone and pulled up a map. I needed to know where I was. I zoomed in on the nearest town and saw a diner about a mile ahead. Desperate for human contact, I started the truck back up and drove straight there. The diner was small, the kind that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. I parked and stepped inside, the warm scent of coffee and bacon momentarily grounding me. A few late-night customers sat at the counter, and an older man in a flannel shirt glanced up as I walked in. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, half-dashed joking. I let out a nervous laugh. "Maybe I have." He gestured for me to sit, and I did, ordering a black coffee. As I stirred in some sugar, I hesitated, then decided to ask, "Have you ever heard stories about a woman hitchhiking on the highway out there? Pale, dark hair, white dress." The man's face darkened. He set his coffee down, his fingers tightening around the mug. "You saw her?" I nodded slowly. "I picked her up, but she disappeared before we got to her stop." He exhaled sharply and shook his head. "You're not the first. That woman died on that road 10 years ago. She was on her way home from a wedding when her car broke down. A truck driver stopped to help, but he wasn't a good man. They found her body in a ditch a week later." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "And she's been hitchhiking ever since." The man nodded, trying to get home. I didn't finish my coffee. I barely made it out the door before my legs gave out beneath me. When I finally got back in my truck, I swore I'd never drive that stretch of road again. But as I merged back onto the highway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw her, sitting silently in the back seat. My name is Mark, and I've been a trucker for over 15 years. I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road, but nothing not the ghost towns, the wandering figures on the roadside, or even the stories truckers tell each other at rest stops prepared me for what happened on exit 66. I was hauling cargo through a long stretch of highway that night. The road was quiet, the moon high, and the only sound was the steady hum of my truck's engine. I'd been driving for nearly 10 hours straight, and exhaustion was beginning to set in. That's when my GPS blared out a sudden, unexpected direction. "Take exit 66 in 1 mile." I frowned. I didn't remember ever seeing an exit 66 on this stretch before, but maybe I had just overlooked it. Figuring I could use some gas, and maybe a quick coffee, I decided to follow the GPS's suggestion. As I approached, the exit loomed ahead, barely lit, the sign weathered and covered in grime. Something about it felt oofa-fi. Turned onto the exit ramp, and that's when my radio crackled to life. "Turn around." The voice was distorted, barely audible. I grabbed the receiver. "Who is this?" Silence then. Another crackle. "Get off this road." A chill ran down my spine. I looked at the radio, then back at the road ahead. The ramp led to an empty, 2-lane road stretching into the darkness. No gas stations, no buildings, just endless pavement lined with skeletal trees. My headlights flickered, and my dashboard clock froze. 3:17 a.m. Something wasn't right. I reached for the gear shift, ready to turn back, when I noticed something in my side mirror. Headlights, approaching fast. My grip on the wheel tightened. Another truck, but there hadn't been any vehicles behind me a moment ago. The lights grew brighter, closer, until they were nearly blinding. I squinted, trying to make out the shape of the vehicle, but it wasn't right. It was distorted, shifting, like it wasn't entirely there then. My truck's engine sputtered. Panic surged through me. The headlights behind me began flashing, and the radio crackled one last time. Too late. My truck lurched forward on its own. My hands were on the wheel, but it wasn't me controlling it. The road twisted and stretched unnaturally, as if I was no longer on the same plane of existence. The sky above seemed deeper, the stars wrong. And then, I saw it. A gas station appeared up ahead, flickering like a mirage. I slammed the brakes, forcing the truck to stop just in front of the entrance. The second I did, the headlights behind me vanished. My truck's clock began ticking again. 3:18 a.m. The gas station looked abandoned, the neon sign buzzing weakly. I stepped out, my boots crunching on gravel, and approached the small, dust-covered window. Inside, a single old man sat behind the counter, staring at me with wide, knowing eyes. "You took the wrong exit," he said before I could even speak. "They don't let you leave." I swallowed hard. "Who?" He just shook his head. "You best hope they didn't notice you." A cold wind blew through the empty lot, and I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever he was talking about, it had already noticed me. I didn't ask any more questions. I got back in my truck, turned it around, and sped back toward the highway. As I merged back onto the interstate, I looked in my rearview mirror. Exit 66 was gone. The sign, the road, everything, like it had never existed. But I know it did, and I know something was waiting for me there. My name is Aaron, and 2 months ago, my wife Megan and I moved into what we thought was our dream home. It was an old colonial-style house, spacious and filled with history. The previous owners had left in a hurry, selling the place at a fraction of its value. We didn't question it. We should have. From the very first day, something felt wrong. The house had a locked room on the second floor. The realtor told us it had been a storage space, and the owners had lost the key. We figured we'd deal with it later, but as the days passed, my curiosity grew. At night, we started hearing noises coming from the other side of the door. Soft scratching sounds, like nails dragging against wood. Megan insisted it was mice, but I wasn't so sure. One night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the walls. Rhythmic, deliberate. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Then, a whisper slithered through the air. "Let me out." I froze. The voice was faint, but it was there, coming from behind the locked door. I shook Megan awake. She mumbled sleepily until she saw my face, then sat up, fully alert. The scratching had stopped. The house now silent, except for our breathing. That morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage and went upstairs. Megan protested, saying we should just leave it alone, but I was done ignoring it. I wedged the crowbar into the doorframe and pushed. The wood groaned in protest. Dust rained down from the top of the frame, but I kept at it. Finally, with a loud crack, the lock snapped. The door swung open. The room was empty. No furniture, no boxers, just for bare walls and a wooden floor covered in dust. But the air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. Then, I saw them. Faint scratches lined the walls, dozens, maybe hundreds of them. Some were deep, carving into the wood like desperate claw marks. And at the very center of the room, written in shaky, jagged letters, "Don't let IT out." A chill ran down my spine. Then something shifted. A shadow moved in the far corner of the room. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it slither along the floor, stretching unnaturally, like ink spilling across paper. Megan screamed. The shadow lunged toward me. I stumbled backward, barely managing to slam the door shut. My heart pounded as I pressed my weight against it, feeling something push back from the other side. The whispering started again, louder this time, pleading, "Let me out." I ran. That night, we packed our things. We didn't sleep, didn't talk. We just left. The house is still there, waiting for its next owners. But the door is open now, and whatever was inside isn't locked away anymore. My name is Lucas, and last month, my wife Sarah and I moved into what we thought was the perfect house. It was an old but beautiful home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood with a spacious backyard. It needed some work, but we were excited to make it our own. From the beginning, something felt off. The house had a basement, something I had always wanted for extra storage. But the moment I stepped inside for the first time, a heavy sensation settled in my chest. The air was thick, damp, carrying a faint, sour smell. The walls were lined with old shelves, and in the farthest corner stood an old wooden wardrobe, its doors slightly ajar. Sarah didn't want to go near the basement. "It gives me a bad feeling," she said. I laughed it off. "It's just a basement. A little creepy, maybe, but nothing sinister." I was wrong. The first few nights were normal. Then, things started happening. It began with the noises. Faint shuffling sounds, as if something was moving below us. At first I assumed it was the house settling. But then, we started waking up to the basement door being open. I was certain I had locked it before bed, but every morning, there it was wide open. The darkness stretching beyond the threshold like an open mouth. One night, I decided to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the stairs. The air grew colder with each step. My breath came out in small white puffs. I shone the light around the room, scanning the shelves, the dusty floor, the wardrobe in the corner. Then, I saw it. The wardrobe door was wide open. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. But as I stepped closer, the beam of my flashlight flickered. My stomach twisted as I noticed something carved into the back wall of the wardrobe. "Don't let it out." A chill ran down my spine. The words were etched deep into the wood, frantic, desperate. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then, the door slammed shut behind me. The basement lights flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. My flashlight stuttered, barely illuminating the space around me. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then, from inside the wardrobe, I heard breathing, slow, raspy breaths, coming from the darkness within. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering violently. The wardrobe door creaked as something shifted inside. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Then, a whisper slithered through the air. "You opened it." The door behind me flew open, and I didn't hesitate. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands trembled as I turned the lock. That night, Sarah and I packed our bags. We left everything behind. The house is still there, waiting for new owners. But I know one thing for certain: the basement isn't empty, and now, whatever was inside the wardrobe isn't locked away anymore. My name is Daniel, and 3 weeks ago, my wife Claire and I moved into what we thought was our dream home, a spacious old house in a quiet neighborhood filled with charm and character. We were excited to start fresh, to build new memories together. But there was something about the house that felt off from the very first night. I noticed it, the mirror in the upstairs hallway. It was a massive antique mirror with a gilded frame bolted to the wall between our bedroom and the guest room. The previous owners had left it behind, and something about it unsettled me. It wasn't just its size, it was the way it seemed darker than it should be. The way reflections moved just a fraction too slow. Claire thought I was imagining things. "It's just an old mirror, Danny. You're being paranoid." I wanted to believe her, but then the reflections started changing. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. Claire was already asleep, and at first, I thought it was just my own reflection shifting in the dim light. But then I realized something horrifying. The reflection of our bedroom door was open. The real door was closed. I spun around, my heart hammering, but everything in the room was as it should be. When I turned back to the mirror, the reflection had corrected itself. I barely slept that night. Over the next few days, it got worse. The mirror would show me things that weren't there: shadows moving in the corners, doors opening on their own. One night, as I walked past it in the dark, I saw something else, a figure standing in our bedroom. I stopped dead, my breath caught in my throat. It was tall, its features obscured in the dim reflection. It stood near the bed, watching Claire sleep. I turned, hoping to see nothing, but the figure was gone. I didn't tell Claire. I didn't want to scare her. I convinced myself I was exhausted, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew the truth. The mirror wasn't just reflecting our home, it was showing something else, something watching us. That weekend I decided to take it down. I grabbed my toolbox and tried prying it from the wall, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself didn't want it removed. Frustrated, I hammered at the edges, but the frame barely shifted. Then, Claire screamed. I turned to see her standing in the bedroom doorway, her face pale. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look." I turned back to the mirror. I wasn't in it. Claire was. The room was. The hallway behind me was. But where my reflection should have been, there was nothing. Then, something moved. Not me. Not Claire. Something behind her reflection, just barely visible in the darkened glass. A shape, shifting unnaturally, reaching out toward her. I grabbed her wrist and yanked her away from the mirror. The glass shuddered violently, as if something had slammed against the other side. Then, all at once, it stopped. The reflection was normal again. Without a second thought, I covered the mirror with a bedsheet. That night, we slept with the lights on. The next morning, it was gone. The mirror, the bedsheet, everything in its place was a blank wall, as if it had never been there. We moved out the same day, leaving everything behind. We never spoke about it again. But sometimes, when I pass a mirror in an unfamiliar place, for just a moment, I swear I see something moving behind me. My name is Nathan, and a month ago, my wife and I moved into our dream home. It was a beautiful Victorian house in a quiet town, nestled between rolling hills and thick forests. It needed a little work, but we were ready to turn it into our forever home. The first few nights were peaceful. We spent our time unpacking, painting, and imagining the future we would build together. But then, the knocking started. It was always at the same time, 3:12 a.m. 3 sharp knocks, always coming from inside the walls. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling. Old homes make strange noises, after all. But then, the knocking started moving. One night, it was from the kitchen walls. The next, from the bedroom. It was as if something was moving through the house, trying to find a way out. My wife, Emily, was the first to see it. I woke up to her screaming. She was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed toward the corner of the room, her hand shaking. "There was someone standing there," she whispered, "watching us." I turned on the light. The room was empty, but the air was thick, suffocating, as if something unseen was still lurking. Emily refused to sleep in that room again, so we moved to the guest bedroom, but the knocking followed us. Desperate for answers, I decided to check the basement. It was the only place we hadn't explored. As I descended the creaking stairs, a foul stench hit me: damp earth, rotting wood, and something else. Something metallic. I shined my flashlight around and froze. There was a door, a small wooden door in the farthest corner of the basement, one that hadn't been there before. My breath hitched. I stepped closer, running my fingers over the surface. The wood was old, but the nails were new. Someone had sealed it shut recently. Then, the knocking came again from inside the door. A shiver crawled up my spine. I should have left it alone. I should have grabbed Emily and run, but I was too far gone, too desperate for an explanation. I grabbed a crowbar and pried the door open. The air inside was freezing. My breath came out in white puffs as I stepped inside. The space was barely big enough for me to stand in, the walls lined with old, crumbling brick, and in the center, a chair, a single wooden chair, covered in chains, rusted and broken. As I stared, a whisper slithered through the room. low and guttural. "You let it out." The basement door slammed shut behind me. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air, my hands covered in dirt. Emily found me sitting on the porch, shaking uncontrollably. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. We left that night, left everything behind. The house still stands, waiting for its next owners. But now, the knocking has started in our new home, and this time, it's coming from inside the closet. My name is Julia, and when my Mark and I moved into our new house, we thought it was the perfect place to start our lives together. It was a charming old farmhouse with plenty of space, a huge backyard, and a wraparound porch. The price was almost suspiciously low, but we didn't question it. We were too eager to make it our own. The first few days were uneventful. We spent our time unpacking, painting the walls, and discussing wedding plans. It wasn't until the fourth day that I noticed something strange. I was upstairs, sorting books in the hallway, when I saw a door that I hadn't seen before. It was wedged between two rooms, a narrow wooden door with an old brass handle. I was certain it hadn't been there when we moved in. I called Mark, but he just laughed it off, saying it was probably a closet we had overlooked. But I knew every inch of this house by now. That door wasn't there before. Curious, I turned the handle and pushed it open. A wave of cold air rushed past me. The room beyond was small and empty, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. The wooden floor was thick with dust, undisturbed. The ceiling slanted slightly, as if it had been part of an attic once. But what unsettled me the most was the overwhelming silence. Not the comfortable kind you feel in an empty house, but something deeper, something watching. I stepped inside. As soon as my foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I turned and grabbed the handle, twisting it frantically, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the wood, calling for Mark. My voice felt swallowed by the room, absorbed into the thick silence. Then, I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, a soft murmur that I couldn't quite make out. But as I pressed my ear against the wall, the voices grew clearer. Low, hurried whispers in a language I didn't understand. Something shifted behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering. The room was still empty, but the air had changed, felt thick, suffocating. The wallpaper seemed darker now, almost pulsing. Then, the whispering stopped, and the door creaked open on its own. I stumbled out, gasping. The hallway looked exactly as I had left it. Sunlight streamed through the windows, the smell of fresh paint still lingering in the air. But when I turned back to look at the door, it was gone. The wall was seamless, as if it had never existed. I tried to explain what had happened to Mark, but he only chuckled and kissed my forehead. "You probably just got turned around," he said. "Old houses are weird like that." I wanted to believe him, but that night, as I lay in bed, I heard the door again. It creaked open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. I held my breath, squeezing. My eyes shut. My body was frozen, every muscle locked in terror. Then, I felt it, a breath against my ear, a voice, no louder than a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I bolted upright, turning on the bedside lamp. The room was empty. Mark stirred beside me, grumbling at the light. I scanned the walls, the corners, anywhere that door could be, but there was nothing. The next day, I searched every inch of the house. There was no hidden door, no extra space where that room could have been. But deep in my gut, I knew it was still there, waiting. That night, I locked the bedroom door, but when I woke up, it was open and muddy. Footprints led from the bed to the spot where the door had been. My name is Ethan, and I was a police officer in the small town of Hollowbrook before I left for good. The town had always had its fair share of ghost stories, but I never put much stock in them. That changed the night I responded to a missing person's call near Black Hollow Road. It was late October, and a thick fog had rolled into town, swallowing the streets in an eerie haze. Dispatch received a distress call from a woman claiming her husband had vanished outside their home. She was frantic, saying he had stepped outside to investigate a noise and never came back. I arrived at the house, a small cottage at the edge of the woods. The fog was so dense I could barely see my own hands. The woman, Mrs. Calloway, met me at the door, her eyes wild with fear. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting something to come out of the mist. "He was just there," she whispered, pointing toward the porch steps. I heard him call my name, and then silence. I ran outside, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sound, just gone. I tried to calm her down, assuring her that we would find her husband. But as I stepped off the porch and into the fog, a strange sensation settled over me, like the air was thicker, heavier. The world beyond the mist felt wrong. I drew my flashlight and scanned the area. The beam barely cut through the fog, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The trees loomed like skeletal figures, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. I called Mr. Calloway's name, my voice swallowed instantly by the unnatural silence. Then I heard it, a whisper, low, distant, shifting in the mist. I turned sharply, my pulse spiking. "Mr. Calloway." No answer. The whispering grew louder, a dozen voices speaking over one another, moving through the fog. My breath hitched as I realized the sound wasn't coming from one direction, it was circling me. Then, the fog shifted. A figure emerged, standing just at the edge of my vision. My flashlight flickered, struggling to stay on. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It had no face, just a dark, hollow void where its features should have been. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, it raised one skeletal hand and pointed at me. The whispers turned into something worse, laughter, deep, distorted, echoing from all around me. My flashlight died, plunging me into darkness. I felt the air shift, the presence moving closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my radio, but all I heard was static. Then, a voice cut through the noise. "You shouldn't be here." A sudden force slammed into me, knocking the air from my lungs. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my ribs. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I swore I saw shapes moving in the mist, twisted, contorted figures watching me, and then, silence. The fog lifted just as quickly as it had come. I gasped for air, my hands trembling as I scrambled to my feet. I was standing in the middle of the road, my cruiser idling a few feet away. The house was gone. The trees were gone. There was nothing but an empty stretch of highway behind me. I drove back to the station in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had happened. When I reported the incident, my supervisor gave me a strange look. "There's no Black Hollow Road in Hollowbrook, Ethan," I protested. But when I checked the town's maps, the road didn't exist. Neither did the Calloways, the house, the missing husband. The whispering fognin of it was real, but I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. My name is Olivia, and I was a real estate agent before I quit my job for good. I used to think old houses were charming, filled with history and untold stories. That was before I encountered the Harper House. Harper House was an abandoned Victorian mansion in the small town of Ashwood. It had been on the market for decades, yet no one ever bought it. People in town avoided it, refusing to even look at it as they passed by. Some claimed it was haunted. Others said people who stepped inside never felt the same again. I dismissed the rumors. It was just another old house that needed the right buyer. I made an appointment to inspect it alone before listing it again. That was my first mistake. The house stood at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by dead trees. The iron gates groaned as I pushed them open, rust flaking onto my hands. The air felt heavier as I stepped onto the front porch. The wooden boards creaked under my weight, but the house itself was silent. Too silent. I turned the key in the lock, and the door swung open with an unsettling ease. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic. I took a cautious step inside, my footsteps echoing through the vast, empty halls. The furniture was covered in sheets, the chandeliers coated in cobwebs. But it wasn't the sight of decay that unsettled me. It was the whispering. At first I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. But as I moved deeper into the house, the whispers grew clearer. Faint, hushed voices, overlapping one another. Some sounded desperate, others amused. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe an old pipe hissing, or my nerves playing tricks on me. I continued my inspection, trying to ignore the growing unease curling in my stomach. Then I heard my name, a whisper, distinct from the rest, slithered through the air. Olivia. I froze. My breath hitched. The name had come from the grand staircase leading to the second floor. The air around me turned ice cold, my skin prickling with unseen static. I should have left, but something compelled me forward. I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched unnaturally long, doors lining each side like the ribs of a great beast. Then, one of them creaked open. A bedroom. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the furniture thick with dust. A massive mirror stood in the corner, its surface dark and rippling like water, and in it, I saw her, a woman, standing behind me. She was gaunt, her skin a sickly gray, her eyes hollow, her mouth stretched open, forming words, but no sound came out. I turned, heart hammering, but the room was empty then. The whispers exploded, hundreds of voices, screaming, crying, laughing. The air grew dense, pressing against me like unseen hands. I stumbled back, my reflection warping in the mirror. The woman's mouth moved faster now, her expression desperate, pleading, "Get out." I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the house, but the next thing I knew, I was in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I peeled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The front door of the house had shut on its own. I quit my job that night. Harper House remains unsold. No one goes near it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, my name, whispered through my window. My name is Daniel, and for the last 15 years, I have worked as a journalist, covering strange occurrences in small towns. I have heard my fair share of ghost stories, local legends, and bizarre tales, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the town of Ravenshade. It all started with a tip about a town where people were vanishing without a trace. No signs of struggle, no explanations, just entire families gone overnight. The locals refused to talk to outsiders, and those who did only whispered about the faceless ones. At first, I thought it was just another urban legend. I was wrong. I arrived in Ravenshade on a foggy evening, the streets eerily quiet. The town was unsettling. The houses were old and decrepit, and despite the town's size, I saw no children playing, no people walking around. It felt abandoned, yet I could sense eyes watching me from behind the tattered curtains. I checked into the only motel in town and decided to walk around before nightfall. As I explored, I found faded missing person posters pinned to telephone poles. Some so old the paper had nearly disintegrated. One caught my eye. It was dated over 20 years ago, yet the ink looked fresh. Then, I saw him. A man stood on the corner of the street, his back turned to me. He wore a dark overcoat, his posture unnaturally stiff. Something about him felt wrong. I hesitated before calling out, "Excuse me, sir, you live here?" Slowly, the man turned, my stomach dropped. He had no face, no eyes, no nose, No nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin where his features should have been. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward. The man nor whatever. He was cocked his head, as if confused by my reaction. Then, from the houses around me, others began to step out. One by one, they emerged from the shadows. Dozens of them, their faceless heads tilting in unnatural synchronization. They did not speak, did not move, just stared at me with an empty, suffocating presence. I turned and ran. My heart pounded as I sprinted back toward the motel, the air around me thickening, pressing against my chest. The farther I ran, the more the town seemed to twist and shift. The streets changed, stretching unnaturally, houses rearranging themselves like a living maze. I reached the motel and slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My breath came in ragged gasps. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? Then, I heard the whisper. Right outside my window, I turned slowly, dread curling in my gut. The faceless man was standing there, inches from the glass, his featureless face pressed against it. Though he had no mouth, I swear I could hear him breathing. Then, in a voice that was not a voice, he spoke inside my head. You should not have come. Darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up in my car, parked at the edge of town. My notepad was gone, my phone wiped clean. The town of Ravenshade was nowhere to be found. Where it should have been, there was only an empty stretch of road, and an old rusted sign that read, Town limits Ravenshadista Baltus, never. My name is Eric, and I made the worst mistake of my life when I decided to take a shortcut through Hollowbrook. It was supposed to be a quiet little town, just a few miles off the highway. I'd never heard of it before, but the map showed a direct route leading through it. I was behind schedule, exhausted, and eager to get home, so I took the turn without thinking twice. I arrived just before sunset. The town looked off. The streets were too clean, the houses perfectly aligned, and every single lawn was precisely trimmed. But the strangest thing, there were no people. No children playing, no cars moving, no voices, just absolute silence. I slowed my car to a crawl, rolling past rows of identical houses. Each one had its curtains drawn, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The place felt frozen in time. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Something about it made my skin prickle with unease. Still, I convinced myself it was just an old, forgotten town. Nothing sinister. Maybe the residents had moved away, or maybe it was one of those places where everyone turned in early. I spotted what looked like a gas station up ahead. The neon sign buzzed weakly, flickering in the dimming light. I pulled up beside the pump, but as I stepped out of the car, I noticed the pumps were rusted, the price per gallon outdated by at least a decade. The glass door of the station was covered in dust, and through it, I could see rows of empty shelves inside. No cashier, no sign of life. Then, I saw movement. A figure stood at the end of the street, barely visible in the fading light. My breath hitched. I waved, hoping for some reassurance that I wasn't alone, but the figure didn't wave back. They just stood there, watching. A chill crept up my spine. Something about the way they stood too still, too rigid made my stomach twist. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided to leave. Maybe it was just a strange, abandoned town, and I had no business being there. But as I turned the car around, my headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. More figures, dozens of them, standing on porches, sidewalks, in the middle of the street, all facing me, all unmoving. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. I pressed the gas, heart hammering, but the car wouldn't move. The engine sputtered and died. I fumbled with the key, desperate to restart it. Then I heard it, a whisper, Not from the outside, from the back seat. I turned, my breath caught in my throat. A woman sat there. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes black as the night. She wore a faded, tattered dress, her hands resting lifelessly in her lap. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "You shouldn't have come." I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figures outside had started to move slowly, unnaturally, their heads tilting at odd angles as they advanced toward the car. Their footsteps made no sound, but the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in like an unseen force. I yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The woman in the back seat didn't move. She just kept whispering, over and over, "You shouldn't have come." The streetlights flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something beyond the figures, a shadow, taller than the rest, its form twisting unnaturally. Its presence alone sent a wave of nausea through me. I felt my vision blurred then. Everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke up, I was still in my car. The engine was running, the radio playing static. The town was gone. I was back on the highway, miles from where I had last been. The road ahead was empty, stretching into the distance like nothing had happened. But when I checked the time, only a minute had passed, and in my rearview mirror, just for a second, I saw her Dot sitting in my back seat, smiling. My name is Adam, and I grew up in the quiet town of Blackwood. Nestled between dense forests and mist-covered hills, it was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to change. But there was one thing that set Blackwood apart from any other town: the old bell tower at the center of Blackwood Square. The tower was ancient, built over a century ago, with a rusting iron bell that hadn't rung in decades. The town elders always said it was broken, but we, the kids, knew better. Legends whispered through the town, passed down from generation to generation. They said the bell didn't ring for the passing of time, it rang for the passing of souls. And when it did, someone in town would disappear. I never believed the stories. I thought they were just old ghost tales meant to scare kids into staying away from the unstable structure. That is, until the night I heard it ring. It was a cold autumn evening, the wind howling through the empty streets. I had just finished my shift at the diner and was walking home, cutting through the town square. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows across the cobblestone paths. The tower loomed over me, its presence unsettling, even though I had passed it 1,000 times before. Then, the air around me grew unnaturally still. The wind stopped. The distant hum of cicadas ceased. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, and then it came. A single, deep chime rang out, echoing through the empty streets. My body went rigid. The sound vibrated in my bones, filling me with a primal fear I had never felt before. I turned toward the tower, my breath hitching in my throat, and that's when I saw him. A figure stood at the base of the tower, half shrouded in the shadows. He was tall, his frame draped in an old-fashioned coat, a dusty hat casting his face in darkness. But even in the dim light, I could see his grin, unnatural, stretching too far across his face. Then, he moved. One slow step forward. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The bell tolled again, louder this time, reverberating through my skull. The figure took another step, then another, his movements unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I finally broke free from my paralysis and stumbled backward. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned and ran, sprinting through the square, my heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, the bell rang a third time. The last thing I remember was that awful grin, stretching wider, his face distorting, as the shadows swallowed him whole. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my bed. My mother was at my side, eyes red and puffy. My father standing at the door, pale as a ghost. They told me I had been missing for 3 days. But the worst part, The bell tower was gone. Not just the sound, the entire structure, as if it had never existed. I asked my parents, my friends, the town elders. No one remembered it. There was no record of it in the town's history, no pictures, no remnants of the foundation. It was like it had been erased from existence. Yet, every night, at exactly midnight, I still hear it. A single, deep chime echoing in the darkness, ringing just for me. And sometimes, if I listen closely, I hear footsteps outside my bedroom door. My name is Michael, and last Halloween, my family learned that some houses don't want to be lived in. We had just moved into a historic home at the edge of town, drawn in by its charming Victorian architecture and spacious rooms. My wife, Rachel, and our son Adam were excited to celebrate our first Halloween in the new neighborhood. The house had been vacant for years, but we didn't question why. We should have. Halloween night arrived, and everything started off normally. Adam dressed as a pirate, eager to fill his bucket with candy, while Rachel and I set up decorations on the porch. The neighborhood was alive with laughter and glowing jack-o'-lanterns, and for a while, it felt like any other Halloween then. The knocking started, not at the front door, from inside the house. At first we thought it was just the old pipes creaking, but as the night went on, the knocks became deliberate, slow, rhythmic, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floorboards beneath our feet. Rachel and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we didn't want to scare Adam. We brushed it off, telling ourselves that old houses made noises. Then, Adam came running down the stairs, his face pale. "Mom, Dad, who's in my room?" Rachel and I froze. "No one, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "You probably just imagined it." He shook his head. I heard someone whispering. They were calling my name. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What did they say?" Adam hesitated. "They said, it's almost time." Rachel and I rushed upstairs. Adam's room was empty, but the air was heavy, thick with something unseen. The curtains swayed, though the windows were shut, and in the corner of the room, where Adam's toy chest stood, we saw something that hadn't been there before. A door, a small wooden door, built into the wall, as if it had always been there. But we knew it hadn't. We had unpacked this room ourselves, and now, the knocking was coming from behind it. Rachel grabbed Adam and backed away, while I stepped closer, my breath hitching in my throat. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers touched the wood, a whisper slithered through the air. "Let us out." The door rattled violently. I stumbled back, grabbing Rachel's hand. "We're leaving now." We didn't pack. We didn't turn off the lights. We just ran. That night, we checked into a hotel, shaken and exhausted. In the morning, I went back to the house alone, determined to prove to myself that we had just imagined it. The house was silent. Still, I went upstairs to Adam's room, my heart hammering as I approached the corner. The door was gone. No seams, no hinges, just a solid wall where it had been. We never went back. We sold the house without explanation, not wanting to burden another family with what we had seen. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I wake up to the sound of knocking, soft, patient, waiting for me to open the door. My name is Emily, and last Halloween, my family and I moved into a new neighborhood, just in time for the festivities. The houses were beautifully decorated, the streets lined with glowing pumpkins, and the air buzzed with excitement. My husband, James, and I were thrilled to be part of such a lively community, and our 8-year-old son, Caleb, couldn't wait to go trick-or-treating. As we walked through the neighborhood that evening, something strange caught my eye. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac. Unlike the others, it wasn't decorated. No lights, no cobwebs, no skeletons. Just an eerie, dark house, standing in stark contrast to the festive glow of the street. The only thing in its yard was a row of large jack-o'-lanterns, their grins carved wider than usual, their eyes hollow and empty. "They look weird," Caleb muttered, pulling at my sleeve, "like they're watching us." I laughed nervously, brushing off his comment. "They're just pumpkins, sweetheart." But as we passed the house, a cold shiver ran down my spine. It felt like those lanterns were following us, their jagged smiles stretching wider in the flickering candlelight. Caleb hesitated near the sidewalk. "Mom, I think they moved." I turned to him, my stomach tightening. "Come on, buddy, let's keep going." That night, after Caleb had gone to bed, James and I sat in the living room, unwinding from the long evening. The doorbell rang. I frowned. It was almost midnight, too late for trick-or-treaters. James went to the door and peeked through the peephole. No one's there. Another chime echoed through the house. I walked to the door, a growing unease creeping up my spine. When I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. The Jack-O single quotes dash lanterns. They were on our porch now. I looked up and down the street. Nothing. No kids, no pranksters, no movement at all. James stepped beside me. How the hell did they? The flames inside the pumpkins flickered violently, as if disturbed by an invisible wind. Then, one by one, they went out, and the door slammed shut on its own. The house went dark. The silence was deafening. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the light switch. The bulbs flickered, barely illuminating the room. Then, a sound, a whispering, dry and raspy, coming from inside the house. James grabbed my arm. "Upstairs, now." We ran to Caleb's room, throwing the door open. He was still in bed, fast asleep. Then, the whispering stopped. For a moment, all was still. Then, I saw them. Shadows stretched unnaturally from the corners of the room, creeping toward Caleb's bed. They were long and twisted, their movements slow and deliberate. I reached for him, but the room suddenly plunged into darkness. The whispering returned closer now, surrounding us. Then, a single voice, breathy and cold. "Carve a smile. Let us in." The lights burst back on. The shadows were gone. Caleb stirred in his bed, yawning, as if nothing had happened. James and I barely spoke as we took turns keeping watch for the rest of the night. At dawn, we gathered every single jack-o'-lantern in our yard and smashed them to pieces. We never saw them again. But I still hear the whispering sometimes, soft, waiting, just outside the door. My name is Brian, and last Halloween, my family experienced something that made us rethink ever celebrating again. My wife Laura and I had always loved the holiday, setting up elaborate decorations and making sure our house was the go-to place for the best candy. Our daughter, Sophie, was 6 years old and had been counting down the days until she could wear her little witch costume and collect as much candy as possible. Everything started out normal. Kids dressed as monsters and superheroes knocked on our door, shouting trick or treat as we handed out candy. Sophie went out with Laura, while I stayed behind to keep the house running. By 10 p.m., the crowd had mostly thinned out, and I was just about to turn off the porch light when the doorbell rang one last time. I opened the door, expecting a late-night group of teenagers. Instead, there was just one child. He was small, barely reaching my waist, dressed in an old-fashioned clown costume, something from another era. His mask was pale white, with painted-on features that looked too realistic. He didn't say a word, didn't hold out a candy bag, just stood there, staring at me. I forced a chuckle. "Hey there, kid. You're a little late, but I think I've got some candy left." The boy tilted his head slightly, but still said nothing. A chill ran through me. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood, completely motionless. The black void of his mask's eyes locked onto mine. "All right," I muttered, grabbing a handful of candy and dropping it into an empty bag hanging at his side. "Happy Halloween." He still didn't move. I cleared my throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Okay, kid, you should probably head home now. It's late." The boy's head twitched slightly. Then he spoke. "Can Sophie come out to play?" My blood ran cold. I hadn't said my daughter's name. I hadn't seen this kid before. My pulse hammered in my ears as I slowly stepped back, gripping the door. "How do you know my daughter?" I asked, my voice unsteady. The boy didn't answer. He just stood there, the mask's painted grin stretching across his face. Then, the porch light flickered. For a split second, the mask didn't look like a mask anymore. I slammed the door shut, locking it as my breath came in short gasps. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone to call Laura. But before I could dial, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. I turned slowly. The boy was there, standing just outside the glass, his face inches from the window pane. "Sophie," he whispered, "come outside." I yanked the curtains closed and backed away. My heart pounded as I waited, every second stretching into eternity. Finally, after what felt like hours, I worked up the courage to peek outside. He was gone. Laura and Sophie returned home soon after, and I told Laura everything. She tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just a prank, but I could see the fear in her eyes. That night, I barely slept at 3 a.m. I woke up to a sound just outside Sophie's room. Laughter, small, childlike. I ran to her room, throwing the door open. She was asleep, safe in her bed. But the window was open, and on the windowsill sat a small, crumpled candy bag, empty. My name is Jessica, and my family has always loved Halloween. Every year, we decorate our house with glowing pumpkins, animatronic skeletons, and cobwebs draped over every surface. My husband, Matt, loves handing out candy, and my son, Tyler, enjoys dressing up and going trick-or-treating. It's always been a night of laughter and fun, but last year, something changed. It started with the candy bowl. Matt had picked up a large ceramic bowl from an antique shop in town. It was black with strange carvings along the rim, symbols I didn't recognize. "Looks spooky, right?" he had said with a grin, placing it on our porch and filling it with candy. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the night went on, I noticed something odd. The candy never seemed to run out. Kids came and went, grabbing handfuls of treats, but every time I checked, the bowl was still full. I assumed Matt was refilling it when I wasn't looking. But when I asked him, he swore he hadn't touched it. That was when Tyler came running inside, his face pale. "Mom," he whispered, "who's the man in the yard?" My heart skipped a beat. I rushed to the front door and looked outside. The street was filled with kids and parents, but no one unusual. "Where?" I asked. Tyler pointed toward the sidewalk. He was standing right there, just staring at the house. He was wearing a mask, but it didn't look like a mask. It looked like a face that wasn't finished. A shiver ran through me. "It's probably just a costume, sweetheart." I forced a smile. Nothing to worry about. But I was worried. The night wore on, and I kept an eye on the candy bowl. The kids continued taking candy, but the level never dropped. I reached in to take a piece myself and my fingers brushed against something cold. I yanked my hand back. The candy shifted slightly, revealing something beneath it. A tooth, a human tooth, yellowed and jagged. I gasped and knocked the bowl over. The candy spilled across the porch end underneath. More teeth. Dozens of them, scattered like forgotten relics. The front door creaked open behind me. Tyler stood there, his face blank. "Mom," he whispered. "He's inside." I turned, my breath catching in my throat. Standing in the hallway was a figure, tall and thin. Its face was smooth, unfinished, as if someone had started sculpting it but never completed the work. Its hollow sockets locked onto mine as it took a step forward. The lights flickered. The air grew thick and cold. I don't remember what happened next. Just darkness. The next morning we woke up in our beds. The candy bowl shattered on the porch. The house was silent. Nothing was missing. Nothing was broken, except for one thing: Tyler's voice. He hasn't spoken a word since that night, and sometimes, when I pass by his room, I hear whispers coming from the dark dot, as if someone else is still there. My name is David, and every year, my wife and I go all out for Halloween. We decorate the house, carve pumpkins, and set up a haunted maze in our backyard for the neighborhood kids. It's our favorite time of year. But last Halloween, something happened that made me never want to celebrate again. It started when I found the mask. We were at a small thrift shop, looking for last-minute decorations, when I saw it hanging on the wall. It was unlike any mask I'd ever seen, pale, almost flesh-colored, with hollow black eyes and a twisted grin. Something about it made my stomach churn, but I couldn't look away. The shop owner saw me staring and smiled. "That one's special," she said. "One of a kind." I asked where it came from, but she just shook her head. "If you like it, take it. No charge." I should have left it there, but I didn't. That night, as we set up the decorations, I put the mask on for a laugh, planning to scare my wife. The moment it touched my skin, a shiver ran through my body. It felt wrong, tight, like it was molding to my face. My vision blurred for a second, and I heard something whisper, faint but clear, "Let me in." I ripped the mask off, my hands shaking. My wife laughed, thinking I was just playing along, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. As the night went on, the trick-or-treaters came and went, and I almost forgot about the mask. Almost. But then, around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. I opened the door, expecting to see leftover kids or pranksters. Instead, I saw him. A man stood at the end of our driveway, wearing the mask. My mask, except I had left it inside. My breath caught in my throat. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, head tilted slightly, staring at me, with those hollow black eyes. I stepped back, heart hammering in my chest, and slammed the door. I turned to tell my wife, but she was already looking past me, her face pale. "David, where's the mask?" I ran to the table where I had left it. It was gone. A slow knock echoed through the house. I grabbed a bat and threw the door open, ready to confront whoever or whatever was out there. But the driveway was empty. The only thing left was the mask, sitting neatly on the porch. I don't remember bringing it back inside. I don't remember anything after that moment. But the next morning, my wife found me in the backyard, standing perfectly still, the mask in my hands. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know where I went. All I know is that I can still hear the whisper, and sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see the mask staring back.